Disturbing story out of Indiana.
Local fertility doctor who's made national headlines.
The center of a controversial case.
Used his own sperm on unsuspecting women.
Could not admit to us how many times he had done it.
A devastating violation of trust.
We hope to establish that not only as an unethical issue, but also as a criminal issue.
Today, we'll be discussing the case of Dr. Donald Cline. Dr. Cline was a man for the people. I mean, he worked hard through his studies, graduated from medical school, and he soon went on to become a very highly regarded OBGYN. Dr. Cline helped perform donor inseminations for those with fertility issues, and many of the patients who came to him were desperate and just very grateful that he was able to help them conceive children of their own. They trusted Dr. Cline, and he helped out so many people throughout his practice. But while externally Cline was thought of by many as this amazing physician doing everything he could to help out couples in need, many didn't know that Cline was hiding an extremely dark secret. As the years went by, DNA testing soon became a thing in the late 2000s, and as the children of Cline's patients began growing up, they began seeking out these DNA testing options to get a better feel of where they might have came from. But as several of them began doing these tests, there was just something very odd with the results they were finding, because a lot of these donor children started to take notice of their very large family tree. And as time went on, months, even days, this tree just continued to grow and grow at an alarming rate. Several of these donor children were very concerned and curious about this strange family tree situation they were having. And it was finally once they were able to investigate their roots when they would find out some news they would have never expected. This tree, in fact, continued to grow. And as it did, to everybody's surprise, Dr. Cline's deep, dark secrets that he held for decades would soon be exposed. And the community, nation, and even world would be shocked about what happened. You might have heard about this case in the Netflix documentary Our Father, which aired on May 11th, 2022. But before we get into this case, my name is Petal Palmer, and on this channel, I post anything involving medical mysteries and crime. If that is something that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing if you end up liking this video. All right, let's get into this case. Donald Lee Cline was born in Danville, Illinois on December 10th, 1938. This town is about 20 miles from Indianapolis, and this is where he was raised. For his undergraduate degree, Donald actually went to the University of Illinois on a basketball scholarship. But unfortunately, he ended up breaking his shoulder, and this resulted in him losing his scholarship. In 1959, Donald married his wife, who he had met in college. And shortly after that, he started medical school at Indiana University. Donald had quite an eventful and unfortunate incident during his time at med school. On August 17, 1963, during his final year, Donald had accidentally hit a 4-year-old girl with his car. And this little girl's name was Angela Golden. The family described that Angela had run across the street to chase after her mother, who was on her way to the store. And extended family members looked on in horror as the sight unfolded. Angela subsequently passed away from this. And this incident was said to have led Donald to turn his life around and find God. He became very religious. He started going to church more. He started teaching marriage counseling in his church. He taught Sunday school, and he really started seeking religion to find purpose. Now, a very important note, by the way, is that for some reason, Netflix seemed to switch up this story as they, 1, changed details on what actually happened, and 2, they didn't cast an actor who was even slightly close in resemblance to the little girl or her mother. They portrayed the story as if Angela was riding on a tricycle. However, in the real case, Angela wasn't riding on a tricycle at all. But more importantly, Angela, the real little girl who was hit by Cline's car in this case, was black. But the little girl that Netflix casted as the actor was white. Many people have called this out in a news report covering the family. Some even speculated that the reason Netflix hid the race of the little girl was because this accident was during the height of the civil rights movement. And some speculated that Donald might have allegedly hit her purposely due to this. But of course, this is all speculation. This is not confirmed to actually be the case. I just thought it would be a fair thing to point out because it is odd how Netflix essentially changed the little girl's identity and falsely reported the case. Especially because after Angela passed away, her aunt had actually named her own daughter after her niece. And unfortunately, in 1994, that Angela too passed away in a car accident just at the age of 15. So this story clearly has much deeper meaning to this family. They lost 2 of their children in almost the same way. The least that could have been done is for their story to be shared correctly. And this isn't the only problem many had with Netflix regarding this case. In fact, Netflix got themselves into some big legal trouble following the airing of this documentary, which we will be getting into a little bit later in the video. During his time in med school, Donald developed an interest in the study of OBGYN. Now, the first artificial insemination with frozen sperm resulting in a successful pregnancy occurred in 1953 when Donald was 15 years old. And the first sperm bank in the United States opened a decade later in 1964 when he was 26. But because of the hostility and judgment many had towards donor insemination, this wasn't publicly announced for nearly a decade later. Overall, though, this knowledge that frozen sperm was still viable, coupled with growing acceptance of fertility treatments within the medical community, led to the development of modern sperm banks. Because it was just a few years later, after in 1971, when Donald began working at a private OBGYN practice. And this is where his true interest in artificial insemination began. Now, for many cultures and people, any topic even vaguely related to intercourse and such is taboo. Discussions on certain topics were unheard of and hushed, and education in many places is genuinely lacking. In particular, the topic of infertility has been historically avoided in conversations. Those facing infertility often didn't want to share that information with anyone. Many were even embarrassed to tell doctors that they were having fertility issues. It was something that was avoided and rather dealt with privately. And it just had many ramifications on those who were dealing with fertility issues, especially regarding their self-esteem. Women are looked down upon for not being able to produce babies, to build a family. Men are looked at as weak or unmasculine if they're infertile. There's just a lot of societal expectation on people to be in a hetero relationship and growing a family. So when unable to do this, many might get shamed by others or feel as if they are a failure. And this isn't just a view from the past. In modern times, this taboo still persists. People still feel shame to this day to sometimes even mention to their own doctor that they're having fertility issues, and many hide from their family if they're using different fertilization methods. Some people also thought that donor insemination was unnatural and that it was controversial. Whenever this topic was brought to the public's attention, people actually spoke out against it. And polls showed that only about 28% of people in the United States approved of artificial insemination during the 1950s. So if doctors decided that if they were going to be doing it, it was best if they did it on the low and continued with discretion. In the case of Dr. Cline, the fertilization method he used was artificial insemination. This, simply put, is a process where the doctor would get a sperm sample in a syringe and they would simply inject it into the patients. Although these treatments are readily available now, they're still considered shameful or embarrassing for many. And with the belief that fresher or more recent sperm was better and the lack of sperm banks at the time, it was hard to get access to sperm. It was still common practice for doctors to use their medical students for sperm samples. They would even try to select a student that shared similar characteristics with the father whenever possible. And in some cases, these students were even compensated for their help. But eventually, as more advancements were made, while still heavily stigmatized, fertility treatment became just slightly more normalized. And this allowed Dr. Cline to build up his practice and become the doctor that he was. As the years went on, more people began getting interested in donating, and the acceptance and use of donor sperm was on the rise. But even with the help this provided to many, there was one extremely unexpected consequence of these inseminations. And this was the fact that the level of secrecy associated with donor inseminations also allowed for protection of criminals and unethical behavior to occur without people being caught. And one of these people included Dr. Cline. After interning at the Indiana University Health Methodist Hospital, Cline served 2 years in the Air Force and 12 years as an active reserve. And in addition to becoming more religious after the incident with the little girl, Cline became very conservative and held strong views on various topics. For example, Cline wanted to to develop a method to freeze eggs instead of freezing fertilized embryos, as his beliefs meant that he viewed embryos as human life, and he didn't like the idea of them being left in a freezer forever if they were unused. Now, Dr. Cline opened his fertility clinic in 1979 in Indiana. The legal name of this clinic was Indianapolis Infertility Incorporation, but it was doing business as, or was known to the public as, Reproductive Endocrinology Associates. And it would later be joined by Dr. Robert Culver, who partnered with Cline from 1987 to 1991. This was a relatively normal clinic. It was a 3-story concrete building. It had the offices, the waiting rooms, the 2 doctors, and Cline's nurse, Jan Shore. Cline even decorated his office with photos of the babies that he had assisted in conceiving. But in addition to the medical stuff and the baby photos, this clinic also had a lot of religious pieces around. In the clinic, there were a lot of religious art and quotes up on the wall. Nurse Jan even said that Cline would often pray in his office while staff were there, and they would just have to wait as he said these prayers. Now, some felt as though Cline was kind of overbearing or was a bit much at times regarding all of the religious stuff. One of Cline's colleagues from the Air Force was a man named Mark Faber, and Mark's wife, Shireen, was a patient of Cline's. Shireen described that with her being of a different religion, being Jewish, while she trusted being a patient of his, she didn't necessarily feel as comfortable with all of the Christian art on the wall. But in response to how she felt, Cline would supposedly tell her things like, quote, "If you want to get into heaven, you need to be Christian." He seemed to be very serious about Christianity and Christianity only. I mean, he was an elder in his church, meaning he governed what was taught in the church. He would even host baptisms at his house and just have 50 to 100 people standing there around his swimming pool as he would just baptize people. While this may not seem too serious, it actually does play a significant role, which I will be getting into later in the video. To many others, Dr. Cline was able to show this kind nature and caring attitude. Some patients are noted saying supportive statements about him, including, quote, "Dr. Cline always put his patients first, empathetic and full of compassion. He sought ways to help families through this most tender period when both husband and wife feel helpless." Not only was he an elder, but he was married and he had 4 children. He even went by the nickname Don, which gave an informal and welcoming air to him. And this allowed him to essentially become the fertility clinic to go to in the area. But on the contrary, in other ways, Dr. Cline didn't always seem so friendly or welcoming. Some have said that during their appointments with him, he would be kind of silent and wouldn't really engage in much conversation with them. Some have even said that if you were a patient of his for years but left the practice, he would often be cold or unresponsive to you. Nurse Jan described his energy as always being just a doctor, solely with doctor-person relationships. And she described him as sort of a, quote, stern father figure. And he was described by many as arrogant, confident, and a know-it-all. Dr. Cline preferred the use of fresh sperm for his donor inseminations. And whenever possible, he tried to perform the insemination within an hour of the sample being produced. Although it was known that frozen sperm was viable, knowledge was not really widespread amongst things like how to properly store frozen sperm, procedures to treat the sperm before it's used, and even places to obtain these samples. And because of this, he believed that using the sperm as soon as possible was key in increasing his success rates. This definitely could have been quite possible considering fertility science was not advancing as quickly as discoveries or findings suggested. Because although this was past the first time that the first sperm bank was opened, it still wasn't far enough in the future for them to be widespread and readily available. And even by then, it was still common practice for doctors to use readily available samples, whether that be from medical students or even residents. In fact, a survey completed in 1977 found that more than half of fertility doctors actually didn't keep any of their records from inseminations, and they did this in an attempt to help keep donors anonymous and to help decrease paper trails. This act alone actually played a huge role for Dr. Cline. He was so highly regarded, he would even have patients who were often referred to him from outside of Indiana. Because one of the reasons that Dr. Cline's patients loved him so much was was the simple fact that he seemed to have discretion and have care in selecting sperm donors. This was at a time when patients didn't have the ability to choose their own sperm donors, and Dr. Cline promised his patients that he would pick the perfect candidate and that he would never tell anyone, even the child who was conceived, that this all occurred through donor sperm. He had a notebook at the clinic for patients to pick donor criteria. In fact, he promised the couples that he would actually find a medical student or resident to donate their sperm who had similar characteristics to their child's father, whether that be in things like appearance or even blood type. And he even told them that they wouldn't have to worry about having too many half-siblings of their child roaming around, because he promised them that the same donor would not be used more than 3 times. Especially because whenever possible, in cases where sperm count was not the problem, Dr. Cline told couples that he would actually use the actual father's DNA to ensure his children would be biologically their own. And he built this brand of being one of the best or top dogs in his field. Now, Dr. Cline was not only considered the top specialist for donor insemination, but he was also considered very highly for laser surgeries to repair fallopian tubes. It's just that donor insemination process is what he would go on to be known for in modern times, especially regarding this case. But while that is what he's most known for, these inseminations were actually not that easy for many to get done. The inseminations were quite expensive and they were often not covered by insurance. Patients, in fact, would have to pay about $7,000 in additional payments for each insemination attempt in order to conceive a baby. Not only this, but oftentimes these appointments would be at strange times or on the weekend due to the appointments being scheduled specifically with the patient's ovulation schedule. To do this, they would use a basal thermometer, as this would help track small rises in temperature and help determine the time of ovulation. And because it was really dependent on the timing, in most cases, it was usually just Dr. Cline and the patient being inseminated who would be the only people in the clinic. They had a set routine whenever these appointments came. Dr. Cline would take the patient back to the exam room, and they would then be left alone in the exam room to get undressed and put on the typical gynecologist appointment paper robe with the extra paper blanket to cover their lap. And while they were getting ready, Dr. Cline would be getting the sperm sample. In the clinic, there was a half bathroom near the waiting room known as the magazine room. And it was in the magazine room where Dr. Cline would go to collect the sample from a medical resident or doctor in training. It was after he got the sample from the donor when the recipient would sit very close to the edge of the exam table with their feet in stirrups and legs spread apart. Dr. Cline would enter the exam room with equipment in hand, and he would then use a long needleless syringe to place the sperm sample directly at the base of the recipient's cervix. And after this is inserted, they would then need to remain lying down for a minimum of 20 minutes to help the sperm's ability to reach the egg. These appointments would be repeated during every ovulation cycle until the patient conceived. For some, this meant just one appointment, but for others, it may have been 5 or 10 or more times before conceiving. And this was the reality for the mother of a woman named Jacoba Ballard, a woman who played a tremendous role in unraveling the lies of Dr. Cline. While this clinic appeared to do wonders for so many people, this image Dr. Cline built wouldn't last for too long. In fact, it would all come crashing down starting in 2014 when Jacoba truly began investigating what actually happened. Jacoba Ballard was born August 26, 1980, growing up in the Indianapolis suburbs. Jacoba had a half-brother from her mother's previous marriage, but it's said that the two were never that close. And she described how when she was young, she always seemed to suspect that she was different from her family, especially her parents. For example, she was the only one in the family with blonde hair and blue eyes, as her parents had brown hair, brown eyes, and a more olive complexion. And from a young age, she just always wondered if she was adopted. At some point as a child, Jacoba's parents went on to get a divorce. And there was one day when Jacoba was 10 years old and she was at home with her mother. At that time, her mother and father were in a fight. She wasn't sure what the fight was over, but it said that suddenly and out of the blue, Jacoba's mother said to her, "Your dad's not your father." It was that very day when Jacoba learned that she had been conceived through donor sperm, that the sperm used to conceive her was said to have come from a medical resident, and that the doctor her mother was treated by was Dr. Donald Cline. In addition to learning this, Jacoba was also told the same information regarding one of Dr. Cline's main rules, that this donor sperm wouldn't be used more than 3 times. So, when considering the 3-time rule, Jacoba knew that by that logic and discounting any twins, that from his clinic, she would have had at least 1 or 2 unknown half-siblings somewhere out there. And Jacoba soon yearned to learn more about her biological family and find any of the siblings that she could. Because of this, sometime around 1999, when Jacoba was around 18 years old, she actually ended up calling Dr. Cline at his Indianapolis infertility clinic where she was conceived. And Dr. Cline actually answered the phone, so they soon began talking. Jacoba asked Dr. Cline if he had any of the medical records or maybe a donor number so that she could track the other siblings that she had. But to her dismay, Dr. Cline responded very straightforward and matter-of-factly to Jacoba, saying like, "Hey, all of these records have already been destroyed. We do this to keep donor information confidential. I can't help you, but good luck on your hunt." For Jacoba, this was very unfortunate. But in general, this was actually the norm in Indiana. Doctors were only required to keep records for 7 years after last seeing a patient. So with it being about 18 years since the donor was likely last used, it would have been 11 years since Dr. Cline wasn't required to keep the records anymore. So he explained this to her, and Jacoba just kind of had to accept that it is what it is. But in addition to telling her this, Dr. Cline again did reiterate to her that the same rule that he always had for the clinic, that the same donor would only be used a maximum of 3 times. And that was all the information he had. For the time being, Jacoba just had to give up. There was nothing that she could have done at that point. No DNA test kits were available at the time, and Dr. Cline had no information on the donor. So she just went on to live her life. It was said that same year, in 1999, she actually got married to her high school sweetheart. After graduating high school, she volunteered as a firefighter. She eventually began working as an EMT, and she later went on to have 2 children of her own. While this may seem like where it all ended for this case, no. This was almost where it truly began, because Jacoba would actually not have to wait forever or give up on her dream of finding her biological siblings. Dr. Cline retired from his practice at Reproductive Endocrinology Associates in 2009. And it was just 5 years later, in 2014, when Jacoba was 34 years old, when she was able to discover some more things regarding her family tree. And what she would find out would be absolutely shocking. Around that time in the 20-teens, there was a rise in websites for individuals conceived by donors to communicate. And of course, with wanting to find her own biological family, Jacoba found use in these websites. She signed up for a site called am4.net. AM4 stands for Americans for Open Records. It doesn't appear to be around anymore, at least not at this address, but AM4.net was founded in 1989, and it was a registry for donor children, parents, and siblings to connect. To complete her profile, Jacoba uploaded her name, her age, and the facility her parents used to conceive. And surely enough, she was able to soon get in contact with 3 other people who all believed that they could possibly be half-siblings. All of their mothers had been inseminated at Dr. Cline's clinic using donor sperm. After taking a genetic test in 2014, one of these possible siblings learned that she actually had 5 other half-siblings who she didn't know about. And these potential siblings suggested that Jacoba get a DNA test so that they could see if they were all related as well. In the early 2000s, a company called Family Tree DNA was the first company to offer ancestry DNA testing to general consumers. In the early years, they offered what was called Y chromosomes STR and mitochondrial DNA or mtDNA testing. The Y chromosome testing can be used to trace one's ancestry from their dad's side, as Y chromosomes are inherited from one's father, and the mitochondrial DNA was used for tracing ancestry from the mom's side, as mitochondrial DNA is inherited from one's mother. As DNA technology became more researched and information continued to spread, More advanced techniques for ancestry testing were beginning to be used, and more commercial services became available for consumers. And with these advances leading to an increase in access to DNA testing, it also led to an increase in those conceived through donor sperm finding new siblings or discovering their deep family secrets they would have never known. And this was the exact case with the individuals involved in this case. They had learned about a company named 23andMe. And this was one of the well-known consumer ancestry DNA testing options that was available. Today, a popular one you might have heard of is Ancestry.com, which started in 2012. However, 23andMe was launched in 2007, and it was the first company to offer something called autosomal DNA testing. The reason this was significant is because unlike the Y chromosomes or the mitochondrial DNA, autosomal chromosomes are inherited from both of a child's parents. So this allowed for maternal and paternal lineage to be looked at simultaneously. And this was a huge improvement from the typical techniques which tested for the maternal side or paternal side separately. The increased information, accuracy, and availability led to many consumers taking these tests, especially around 2014 to 2016. And this is exactly what Jacoba did in 2014. After completing the testing and sending it in, Jacoba did in fact receive results. And finally, after many years, her eagerness for finding her biological siblings was finally answered. According to the test, it showed that Jacoba in fact didn't have only the 3 half-siblings that she'd met, but including these individuals, she also had 7 other half-siblings. Jacoba was extremely happy about this news. She was just glad that after all these years, she was able to find the exact people who she was looking for. After discovering all of this, Jacoba then went on to share this information of her having 7 half-siblings with her mother. And her mother again confirmed that the name of the fertility doctor who did her insemination was Donald Cline. But despite the excitement she had, there was something that was pondering in Jacoba's mind. Something just felt very off for her. Jacoba began reaching out to her other half-siblings and actually found out they had a lot in common. Because not only did they all have professions in the medical field, but guess what? All of their mothers had gone to Cline for fertility treatment. And not only this, but remember how there was a 3-time maximum on the amount of times a donor was used? Well, somehow, some way, Jacoba had 7 other siblings coming from Dr. Cline's clinic, and none of them were twins. This meant that at his clinic, the same donor would have been used at least 8 times. Not only this, but the siblings had an 8-year age gap ranging from the eldest in 1979 to the youngest in 1987. And Dr. Cline was apparently using sperm more often from the medical residents. Now, a medical residency for OBGYN is usually a maximum of 4 years. So the fact that there was an 8-year age gap kind of stood out a bit. And Jacoba suspected that there might have been some strange activity regarding the relation of her and the other siblings. Using the 23andMe site, Jacoba began creating a family tree. Now, even though at the time only a few of them had matched, soon enough they learned that they had much more distant relatives in common. And one of these common relatives they shared was a second cousin named Sylvia Pochner. Jacoba and the others decided that to discover more, it might be best if they reached out to see if Sylvia knew anything about a possible donor or father in their family. Jacoba ended up messaging Sylvia on Facebook. And Sylvia actually responded to Jacoba's message, and they were able to talk for a bit. Jacoba explained the situation, Sylvia gave her a little bit of background, and eventually, Sylvia provided the siblings with a list of surnames that were in the family. And it was after doing this when light bulbs began to light up for the siblings. One of the names that stood out to the siblings was the last name Swinford. And the reason this name in particular stood out is because this was in fact Donald Cline's mother's maiden name. And so Jacoba asked Sylvia, hey, would you happen to know if there was a Cline in the family? And to their suspicion, Sylvia confirmed that she was in fact related to Donald Cline. And she confirmed that this was her cousin she called Don, and he was in fact a doctor. In fact, they soon discovered that they were genetically related to more than 70 of Cline's relatives. And it was after this when everything started to add up. Jacoba soon realized that the reason they might all be related to each other is either because Cline must have used a sample from one of his family members, Or Cline must have used a sample of his own to impregnate their mothers himself. Of course, at the time, they had nothing to prove this. They didn't have Cline's DNA, and Jacoba received no information from Cline regarding this. But regardless, the thought of either of these scenarios happening truly just made her feel sick. Jacoba didn't know where to turn, and she wanted this to be seriously looked into. So she started searching up on Google where it would be best to file a complaint against a doctor. And it was after this search when Jacoba and 3 other siblings went on to file separate reports with the Indiana Attorney General's office. Jacoba received a response back from the current Attorney General, Greg Zoller, on December 31st, 2014. And this letter essentially just stated that they received the report and that the investigation is pending. Now, Jacoba really wanted to find the other siblings and families who may have been related to her and affected by this case. But every time she tried following up with the Attorney General's office, she would continually receive a generic investigation pending email, or her phone calls would return unanswered. She even reached out to the nation's Attorney General, but no response. And with the amount of new siblings she was discovering as time went on, the only way she would have been able to do this on a wider scale was if she could get the story out there to the public. It was at that point in February 2015 when Jacoba began reaching out to various different news and media outlets to investigate her story. But even still, with all of the evidence she had backed up, none of these outlets wanted to take up the siblings' story. Jacoba reached out to whoever she could and wherever, whether it was the smallest news outlet or the largest, but still nobody was interested. That, of course, was all until one day when Jacoba noticed she received a message on Facebook. And when she opened this message, she finally received a reply from somebody who was interested and wanted to investigate this case. And this person was named Angela Ganote. Angela is a news anchor for Fox 59. And after Jacoba sent her a message on Facebook, within just a few days, she met with Jacoba and a discovered sibling to look into what was going on. Angela was very impressed by the amount of evidence Jacoba presented to her. And it was very quick when Angela headed to her news director to tell them all about it. She described Jacoba's story and explained how the Attorney General seemed to not do anything about it. Angela knew at the very least it was clear that there was evidence of these siblings being related to Cline. All there was left for them to prove was that Cline did what many claimed or suspected. Angela proceeded with her investigation of the case, and she reached out to Cline in an attempt to get an initial comment on what happened from his point of view. And Cline did in fact reply to her. But all Angela got from this conversation with Cline was him saying that the samples used were only from doctors in training, that it would have been impossible for any of the samples to be used more than 3 times, that he wasn't guilty of what everyone was accusing him of, and that the siblings were lying. And so Angela was like, okay, cool. So how about we get a DNA test just so we could prove that this all was just a false alarm and just help these individuals out? But Cline refused to get any DNA tests done, and he quickly hung up the phone. Angela unfortunately didn't get anything much out of this phone call. But what's very interesting is that not too long went by after this when Cline contacted Angela himself on April 30th, 2015. He sent her an email. And in this email, he stated that this investigation she was doing could violate HIPAA laws. He quite literally told her to, quote, be very careful. And he later told Angela that if her and Fox 59 ever aired anything even remotely suggesting he was the father of the siblings, that he would sue them. Now, not too long went by after telling all this to Angela when Cline actually ended up personally contacting Jacoba. He called her home phone, and during this call, he began venting about how irritated he was with Fox 59's investigation. Cline had told Jacoba that the world doesn't need to know about the situation, and he went on about how Jacoba was ruining his life if she continued to share information with the news station, how Angela just wanted ratings for the TV station, how it's Jacoba's fault if everything gets revealed, and how this all could ruin his marriage and reputation in the community. Little did he know, Jacoba actually recorded this conversation, and she subsequently sent it off to the prosecutor's office later on. Which you'll just hear everything he was saying below.
They're trying to improve their ratings. And my wife and I, after 57 years of marriage, if this comes out, our marriage will be over.
I feel like I'm being blamed for this, like it's my fault. I don't understand.
It's your fault because I don't care who you tell. It's just putting it on television for the entire world to see.
Angela ended up airing her first story on the insemination fraud on May 12, 2015 on Fox 59 News. The only person named in this story was a donor child named Carrie. This story was shared by Angela after interviewing Carrie, Jacoba, as well as one other sibling. And during this interview, Carrie stated, quote, "I went from being an only child to having at least 8 siblings overnight. I think as humans, we have the need and want to know where we have come from, where we fit in, where we belong." Although information regarding the case was shared, because they didn't fully have evidence linking everything to Cline, Angela and Fox 59 decided that they weren't able to yet use his name. They did not have a DNA sample from him, so they could not legally prove any of the claims yet. They needed somebody in the state to get an order for Donald Cline's DNA. Jacoba again contacted the Attorney General's office to get an update on the status of this case, but they didn't reply to any of her calls. And Jacoba decided at that point she'll just have to do some investigating herself. She began researching any possible things she could find on Cline, and especially with how much the Attorney General's office was holding off the investigation, Jacoba and the other siblings too wanted to meet with Cline to get a better understanding themselves. One of Jacoba's half-siblings went on to reach out to several members of Cline's family via Facebook, explaining the situation and trying to get some answers. They messaged Cline's children and grandchildren who were all over the age of 18 and just asked if they knew anyone in their family who had donated sperm. But after reaching out, a source actually states that apparently all of them except for one actually ended up immediately blocking the sibling after this message. The only person who actually replied back wanting to help was Doug Cline. And Doug was one of the 4 of the adult children Cline had. Doug replied to Jacoba a week after she sent her message. They spoke over the phone and Doug relayed all of the information his father Cline told him. And this was some startling news because it was after this when Doug offered to meet with Jacoba and another half-sibling to discuss all of their findings and to answer any questions. At this meeting, alongside Doug was another one of Cline's adult children, Donna. They all met at Jacoba's church in Brazil, Indiana. And as Jacoba shared what they found, Cline's children made sure to take their own notes so that they could help in the best way that they could possible. During the conversation, Doug told Jacoba that he ended up speaking to his father, Donald Cline, to get some more information. And it was then when he spoke to his father when Donald Cline admitted some suspected news. Cline confessed that he likely was in fact the father of Jacoba and these siblings, because he said that he did occasionally donate his own sperm. But he said that he did this through a sperm bank and only did that whenever there wasn't a donor available. He apparently said that the DNA samples might have even gotten split. And Cline said that at the end of the day, there would be absolutely no more than 10 siblings. Which is odd because it was only soon later when more than 10 siblings that Cline had described had been discovered. One of these siblings included Julie Harmon. She was the daughter of a woman named Diana Kiesler, and she discovered she was the 14th sibling after seeing Jacoba speak on the news. Jacoba just knew that based on everything they'd gathered so far, everything Cline said wasn't true in the slightest. And she told Doug this. She knew at that point that the only way she could get some answers was if she got it from the source himself, Donald Cline. And she asked Doug if this would be possible to set up. Now, despite this admission and willingly telling this to Jacoba, it was said according to an affidavit that Doug had initially asked Jacoba to keep the story a secret. But Jacoba didn't want to keep this a secret at all. No, she wanted to speak to Cline and find what on earth went on. And soon enough after their request, Jacoba and 5 other siblings were able to meet with Cline at a restaurant in Greencastle, Indiana in March 2016. While it was quite insightful, This meeting was also far from a warm and welcoming one. The siblings sat inside the restaurant as they waited for Cline to arrive. And once he did, Jacoba described the intensity of his footsteps and the menacing sound as his cane hit the floor, coming towards them. Once Cline was finally right there in front of them, it was clear that he had a gun strapped to his hip. And this was something described on other accounts of people meeting with Cline, with Jacoba describing this as being an intimidation tactic. Now, during the meeting, Cline went on to introduce himself. And after he introduced himself, he then asked, like, hey, what's everyone's name? What's your age? And what do you do for work? And Jacoba described that this did feel quite odd, as she claimed, quote, it was almost like he was ranking us, like, let me see which one of my offspring made it to the top. I felt like we were being judged. It was clear to Jacoba Cline seemed to have no visible emotion and appeared to stay cool, calm, and collected while facing all of his children. Later into the conversation, Jacoba went on to ask Cline for his detailed medical history, especially after noting that some of her siblings had been suffering with autoimmune disorders. But Cline ended up dismissing her request and just asserted, like, hey, there's nothing to be worried about regarding my medical history, which we will be talking about a little bit later, but newsflash, was a complete lie. And he said he wasn't even sure when it was that he stopped using his own sperm. It is, however, speculated that he stopped in 1986, as the youngest known offspring was born in 1987. So even though this was a shocking revelation, and you would hope there would be some kind of remorse towards the feelings of the donor children, it was said that Cline went on to downplay what had happened, and he minimized the scope or the severity of his actions. To try justifying what happened and help them cope, Cline went on to hand Jacoba a piece of paper that contained a scripture from the Bible. This scripture was Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, and it read, quote, before I formed you in your mother's womb, I knew you. Jacoba already knew that this was just another manipulative tactic, and so she declined this paper and angrily told Cline, quote, you're not going to use my God to justify your actions. And when one of the siblings went on to ask Cline, why would you use your own sperm to impregnate our mothers? Cline just told them, look, I really just wanted to help these women who were desperately wanting a baby. And contrastingly to the maximum of 10 siblings he cited before, this time, Cline claimed that there would absolutely be no more than 15 siblings. This meeting ended with very shocking confessions, but everyone knew there was much more to the story. Because surely enough, as time went on, more siblings had been found. There was Matt White, who was sibling number 17, Heather Wook, sibling 22, Lisa Shepard, sibling 33, Jason Hyatt, sibling 48, Carrie Foster, sibling 53, and Allison Kramer, sibling number 61, who, by the way, was also the daughter of Cline's own colleagues we discussed earlier, Shireen and Mark Faber. As people continued to use consumer DNA tests, more people began getting linked to those original half-siblings, and the number of siblings just continued to grow. Heather even said, quote, we find new siblings regularly, especially after major holidays because DNA testing kits are big gifts. And Jacoba described the emotions they feel every time a new sibling pops up, as she stated, quote, every time we get a new match, I give them this news and it's like I'm ruining their life. After the meeting with Cline, Jacoba went to Angela with all of this information and told her that Cline admitted to being their father. So Angela yet again reached out to Cline. She wanted to meet with him in person so that she would be able to get a better understanding from him as to what happened. And she was gearing up to finally name Cline as the person who was mentioned in that previous May 2015 article. She essentially let him know, like, hey, you're about to be named. If there's anything you would like to say, please do. And surprisingly, finally, somehow in the summer of 2016, over a year after she had initially emailed him, Cline, in fact, agreed to meet with Angela. Many people were concerned for Angela's safety regarding this meeting, being that he often carried a gun, and with the amount of threats with words and lawsuits that Cline had thrown at Angela, her boss at the time was very concerned about her safety and even wanted her to take the security guard with her. Angela, of course, knew nothing about Cline other than the things that he's done regarding this case. And based on everything that has happened and hearing from Jacoba that he carried a gun Angela made sure to set this meeting with him in a public space to keep everything more safe. But she genuinely just felt as though by that point, Cline was just really desperate. They arranged for the meeting to take place at a Panera restaurant in Traders Point, Indianapolis. And on the day of this meeting, Angela and Cline both arrived at the Panera, greeted each other, and they quickly got on to discussing what needed to be discussed. What Angela even described as weird was that Cline did in fact have his gun on him, but one of the first things he said when he walked in was, quote, "They don't allow guns in here, do they?" Again, kind of just reconfirming that alleged intimidation tactic that was mentioned. This meeting went on for about 1 hour, and throughout the entirety, Angela just felt as though Cline was essentially begging her to not air his story. Angela said that Cline went on to ask her, quote, "Please don't out me. I am well respected in the community. I'm an elder at my church. There are hundreds of people that look up to me. If the kids and the youth at my church know this, it will devastate them. It will make them think differently about me and our church and our religion. If my wife finds out, she will consider this adultery. This could make me lose my marriage and my family. Why would you do that to me?" Cline went on to explain how he felt as though he was helping the mothers. And something that's also strange is that at the beginning of this meeting, he actually told Angela that he knew where she lived and where she was from. And Angela felt like this was his way of pressuring her that she better be careful speaking about him, especially after his email. But Angela wasn't backing down whatsoever. And she straight up told Cline that this was all him. He did this to himself. And she said, quote, "We have that burden to tell the truth, and the truth matters." Angela saw right through him. She described how she knew that he was a Christian, and she too was a Christian herself. And Angela said that she fully believed that Cline must have known she had a good heart and knew that she believes in forgiving people's sins or mistakes. And while these are values that Angela upholds herself, it was clear to her that Cline wasn't sorry for his actions whatsoever. And to her, it was just rather pathetic. At no point did he apologize or at the very least acknowledge that he hurt others. Everything that Angela gathered just clearly showed her that the only person that Cline viewed as a victim in this entire situation was himself. And it was rather everyone else who was calling him out who were instead the ones hurting him. Cline was extremely nervous that any type of exposure from this case would just destroy his image. So in order to protect his image, that's when it was said that he started to resort to very questionable behavior, because many have claimed that he began threatening, tormenting, and harassing his donor children and anyone involved in this case. It was said that there were instances in which Cline would call the donor children over the phone and would just verbally harass them. Not only this, but although he hadn't been caught in the act, many of the donor children who went public suspected that he was also responsible for committing a slew of strange attacks on them. For example, in one particular instance, Jacoba woke up and went outside to get in her car. But when she did, she noticed that the lug nuts from all 4 of her tires had been removed and were missing. In another instance, Julie, the 14th sibling's computer, was hacked, and any files or emails regarding Cline were all erased. And lastly, Heather, the 22nd sibling, was said to even have received multiple harassing phone calls from not just Cline, but from the cemetery. And in these calls, they were, quote, asking her if she wanted to purchase a plot for her to be buried in, which she claimed must have been done, as she said, quote, "I think it was to rattle me, to re-traumatize me so that I would be quiet. I don't think he wanted any of us to talk publicly if he could help it." Especially considering the things he said to Jacoba during their phone call.
What you're doing is that you're telling the world, and the world doesn't need to know.
I'm not trying to do harm to you.
Well, you are.
But none of these threats deterred any of the donor children because they were destined to discover the truth. And they wanted Cline to face punishment to the fullest extent of the law for this wrongdoing. Now, by that point, the Attorney General office still wasn't getting back to Jacoba on the status of the investigation, or if there was an investigation at all. The only person they had was Angela, and Angela continually contacted the office just asking to interview, to know anything regarding the case. Angela reached out to several of the donor children, met with them, listened to their story, and within weeks of starting, she reached out to the state's attorney general at the time, Greg Zoller, to get some updates on their end of the investigation. She reached out several times to get their status of the investigation, but unfortunately, most of these times ended with unanswered emails or no comments. And with the indifference the Attorney General's office seemed to have about the situation, it was at that point when she decided to carry the case straight to Tim Delaney at the Marion County's prosecutor's office. It was only when she brought this information to the prosecutor's office when they finally had someone who decided to get involved in the case. Tim Delaney claimed that when he got the inquiry, there hadn't been any true investigation done on the case as yet. So he didn't see any of this beforehand. And despite the office questioning Cline regarding the situation and there being strong evidence backing up the donor children's claims, there was just one major problem with getting him prosecuted. And this was the simple fact and unfortunate fact that even if Cline was the father of all of the donor children, there was technically nothing that he had done that was against the law in Indiana or federally. Prosecutor Tim Delaney said that it wasn't necessarily that he didn't want to prosecute Cline, it was more so the fact that he was saying how Indiana juries wouldn't buy the theories of rape or R-word by deception. By the way, I just had to censor the R word to keep it YouTube friendly. And they would rather argue that the patients did consent to donor insemination and they did want a baby. So prosecutors couldn't constitute this as any kind of assault or battery simply because of the fact that the patients had consented to receiving donor sperm. And I guess it unfortunately didn't necessarily matter to the law where the donor sperm came from. So, to their misfortune, the state prosecutor, Tim Delaney, concluded that they wouldn't be proceeding with any kind of prosecution regarding the inseminations because there were no laws in place stating that what Cline did was a crime. And there was nothing else they could really do about it. Many felt as though the prosecutor's office didn't try hard enough to find just something that could prosecute Cline for what he did. They thought that Cline had to, at the very least, could have been written into some kind of law, even if it constituted as battery. Jacoba actually said that she brought up an example to Tim Delaney, where she asked him if she were to spit in his face, would that be battery? To which he replied, yes. Liz White, the mother of Matt or sibling 17, said that prosecutors stated that for it to be considered sexual assault, there had to be two components, force and non-consent. So, by that logic, how would it not have been considered battery for Cline to take his sperm and inject that into patients without them knowing it was his? There's an excerpt from Jody Madeira. She's a law professor from Indiana University and stated this in the documentary. I'm just going to read out what she said because I do think it's very significant and helps put things in perspective. She stated, quote, "There is a provision in Indiana law that says R-word can include conduct which a victim does not know is sexual, but the perpetrator knows is sexual." And that, I think, is actually the closest charge, because in order for him to produce this sperm, he had to masturbate in very close proximity to the office where a patient was waiting, unclothed from the waist down, with a paper cloth covering her knees and knees spread apart. Who's to say when this touch stops becoming sexual and starts becoming clinical? I think even if he's not thinking of the patient in a sexual sense, the very fact that he's still under the effects of physical arousal makes this a sexual touching. Even if he's thinking of his wife or a pink fuzzy bunny rabbit, it is still a sexual act. Especially because when you asked his patients, Debbie Pierce said, quote, "If he asked me if it would be okay for him to be the donor, I would have not said yes, I would say no." Diana Kiesler said, quote, "It was a violation of him into me." And Liz White said, quote, "The issue for me is there was no consent. He didn't give me a choice. I did not want his semen. I don't care how it came into my body. It was against my knowledge. It was against my consent. When Matt's DNA test came back, my first words were, I was R-word 15 times and didn't even know it. But still, prosecutors couldn't constitute this as a crime. This could have very easily been where they would have had to end this case. But fortunately, soon enough, they were eventually able to find some kind of loophole that would finally hold Cline somewhat accountable for something. Disregarding the threats, when Angela was speaking with Cline, he went on to explain to her, guess what? I actually responded to the Attorney General's office. They know what's going on. Everything on my end is all good. Now, for one, this confirmed to Angela that Cline had acknowledged that the office did in fact begin an investigation, but two, this is exactly where he messed up. Because it was kept so hidden, many initially didn't know that in January 2015, after Jacoba and the siblings sent their reports to the Indiana's Attorney General's office, the office actually ended up sending Cline 2 letters indicating that he was under investigation. They sent a questionnaire and he was given 20 days to respond to this letter. In his response, Cline told them that he did indeed perform artificial inseminations from 1971 to 1981 using fresh sperm. But citing the Indiana statute, he also told them that doctors didn't need to keep patients' records past 7 years, and so the patients' records at this clinic had already been long destroyed. Not only this, but again, he told them exactly what he told his patients, that he didn't use the same donor for more than 3 pregnancies, and that sometime in the 1980s, instead of fresh sperm, he switched to frozen samples from a now defunct place called Fola's Laboratories, in order to follow the American Society of Reproductive Medicine's new standard of care. In fact, he actually told investigators, quote, I can emphatically say that at no time did I ever use my own sample for insemination, nor was I a donor. In fact, if this woman is saying this or writing this, I believe she's guilty of slander and or libel. Not only did he verbally state it, but he had actually signed off on some legal documents stating that he had not used his own sperm to impregnate his patients. So while he might have thought that this was okay and that they were going to take it as it is, Cline didn't realize that maybe they would want to test to confirm if this was a fact or not. Angela knew for certain that there definitely was at least one thing Cline did that was in fact a crime. And the crime he did was lying to the investigators. If you lie to the government, FBI, whoever, you can be charged with a crime. Signing a document and agreeing to false information could be considered fraud and obstruction of justice, which would be a felony offense. So all this did was confirm to Angela that Cline had lied to investigators, which she told them straight up that they were blatantly being lied to. And this is where things were about to change for Cline. Because it was after they discovered Cline had sent these false letters when Tim Delaney and those in the prosecutor's office were finally able to theorize how to get Cline nailed for something. In June 2016, the prosecutor's office interviewed Jacoba, the other half-siblings, and they collected their DNA sample as well. And just that next month, in July, the prosecutor's office executed a warrant for Cline's DNA and got a sample from him. It seemed to take a little over a month for the results to come, or at least to be announced to others. Because in September 2016, after all these years and all of these siblings, an answer was finally found. Soon enough, the results from the DNA test came back positive, and it showed that Dr. Donald Cline was in fact the biological father of Jacoba and the other siblings. He had a 99.9997% probability of paternity for Jacoba. In fact, it was said that, quote, at last count, DNA test results have linked Dr. Cline to 57 children of former patients.
And how many times did you use your own sample?
Sparingly, but keep in mind, we're talking 30 to 35 years ago, and I can't remember. All the records have been shredded.
Also, remember how Cline claimed that he used Fola's Laboratories to get donor samples? Well, in February 2016, investigators issued a subpoena to Fola's Laboratories, and surprise, surprise, they discovered that there were absolutely no records indicating that they've worked with Cline. So that too definitely didn't back up his claims. And it was then on September 9th, 2016, when Angela published the story revealing that Donald Cline, a local fertility doctor accused of using his own sperm on patients, was charged with 2 felony counts of obstruction of justice. At first, Jacoba wanted to stay anonymous. She didn't want her name to be announced, and while other sources did post her name from the court documents, Angela on Fox 59 didn't initially. But it was when Jacoba discovered that Cline was not going to be charged with the insemination fraud, but was only going to be charged with obstruction of justice, when she made sure that she made herself public and speak with any available media source to share her story and help hold Cline accountable, saying, quote, "I want to see doctors held accountable. I want laws." Around this time, in a letter to the Attorney General's office, Cline admitted that he actually could have used his sperm as many as 50 times. And through more investigation, they soon found out what actually happened during these appointments. Liz White, Matt's mother, had frequently gone to Cline's clinic for fertility treatment and for the insemination. She noted that Cline was always alone in his office, whether that be on the weekend, during the week, midday, or in the evening. He was always the only person inside of the office. And she described how whenever Cline left his patients, including herself, in the exam room, that she would get undressed, he would go into another room, which she and I'm sure other patients thought, or at least expected, would be him leaving to collect the sample from the donor or the lab. But what would actually happen was that during these appointments, Cline would leave the patient alone. He would go into the other room, and whenever he was in that room, he would then do the thing he needed to do right then and there to produce a sperm sample. And it was after he was finished with himself when he would then leave the room, syringe in hand, and inject his own newly produced sperm sample into the patients. So it's not even like he just had sperm frozen and just took it out whenever he needed to use it, which, by the way, would still be wrong because that's still not what they agreed to. But he would actually leave the other room, do the thing with himself, and then use that to inject into his patients right then and there. This fact alone made so many people feel extremely violated. Liz White described, quote, "A man's mind following ejaculation, there's a lot of dopamine, a lot of serotonin, and norepinephrine. All of those are mood enhancers that bring about wonderful feelings for them. We came in for a medical procedure. I feel like I was R-word 15 times. Dr. Cline had lied to many mothers and patients, especially because not only did he have the 3-time donor rule, but for some patients, he also was supposed to use their own husband's sperm for the insemination. And it was agreed upon that they would be doing this. For example, in Diana Kiesler's case, the mother of Julie, Cline was supposed to use Diana's husband's sperm. In Lisa's case, he was supposed to use her father's sperm. Even his own friend Mark, in Shireen, his wife's case, he was supposed to use Mark's sperm to conceive their daughters, Allison and her twin. But even in these cases, he used his own sperm for this procedure. They only found out about this after Allison's own children were diagnosed with a genetic disorder. So she got some DNA testing, which placed her in the family tree of the donor children. She noticed, but didn't look too deeply into the message from Jacoba because obviously I'm sure nobody thinks of the worst when looking for their genetic history. But it was after a Dr. Phil episode aired on December 9th, 2019, when Allison saw Jacoba again, and it was during this airing when she had learned the story of what Cline had done to her and her family, and his own friend. Also, something that's just very strange about Allison's case is that not only was Cline her mother's OBGYN, but he was also Allison's OBGYN too. So, for all those years as an adult, Allison would go in to get all types of very personal medical examinations by a man who was her biological father. And he knew that this was his biological daughter throughout every single appointment or exam she had with him, while she had not even a clue. Dr. Cline had even promised to try to match physical traits between the donor and the father, but instead he decided to use his traits for everyone, regardless if they were similar to the father's or not. Cline had said a donor would not have been used to conceive more than 3 babies, yet Dr. Cline had been proven to be the father of 94 children conceived at his clinic. 94, which is wild, especially because most of these children live within a 25-mile radius, and there also may have been more donor children who haven't tested their DNA. This just creates a ridiculous chance that people in this area might inadvertently date or even marry a biological sibling. This was just very unethical and wrong. Dr. Culver stated, quote, "It was a breach of trust between a physician and his patient. One could say immoral." Because it wasn't even just the fact that he completely violated his patients, but it's also the fact that there were many medical problems that Dr. Cline had, which didn't need to unwillingly be introduced into one's family. A sperm donor typically undergoes harsh scrutiny and a full medical evaluation before their sample is used. Any medical issue they have, or even being the carrier of a trait, could be enough to disqualify a donor. 30% of sperm donors don't even make it through the screening process. And Cline would have most definitely not been one of the people who would have made it through himself, because Cline had a condition called rheumatoid arthritis. And this is a chronic autoimmune disease which is often characterized by painful inflammation of the joints. With having this, Cline, by most standards, would not have been allowed to be a sperm donor. And what's even worse is the fact that many of the children conceived with his sperm sample actually ended up inheriting these autoimmune issues. And some are cited as having to take handfuls of pills every morning just to get through the day. Many of the donor children till this day are still seeking a diagnosis for their health issues. It was said that majority of them have random health issues, and this likely wouldn't have been a problem had Cline just used the true donors that he was supposed to use. Not only this, but it's also of note that the oldest donor sibling was born in 1972. Cline started his own clinic in 1979. This means that before Cline even opened up his own clinic, he actually had been using his own sperm while working at the private OBGYN practice he worked at, and continued at least up until 1986. 2 years since Jacoba's initial complaint to the Attorney General's office, Cline had his time in court. And this was a very hard moment for many. Julie stated that her first time seeing Cline was at the court, and she described how when he walked down the aisle, he accidentally brushed up on her, and it, quote, almost brought her to her knees. And she described how he had no regard for them. And even Matt, he said that just seeing him there, he was genuinely scared of him. Now, Jacoba was excited in court because she wanted to see him get sentenced. And she and many of the other siblings did very powerful victim impact statements. Jacoba wanted the judge to be appalled by this case, and she hoped that Cline would get jail time for what he did. But there was an issue with the victim impact statements. During Jacoba's statement, she received a lot of objections, because she wanted to share her and her siblings' stories and how it affected them. But the defense kept objecting because they were concerned with the case just in relation to Cline lying to the state, and not about what he did with the insemination fraud. In this particular trial, it was very unfortunate, but the state was considered the victim, not the patients nor the donor children. And Prosecutor Tim Delaney asked the judge if they can just make sure that the crimes he committed remain a felony on his record and that they deliver executed time, i.e. time in jail. But what was very interesting was that the judge actually felt sympathetic to Cline. Many people from Cline's community, whether it be former patients, church members, family, many sent in letters in support of Cline, saying how good of a man he was. In fact, a prosecutor from Boone County, where Cline lived, sent in a letter themselves, and they argued that Cline was a good man, and they asked the judge if there could be leniency. By especially that point, Jacoba felt as though the state was corrupt. With how the judge was sympathizing with Cline and the prosecutor from Cline's community asking for leniency, she believed that he had to just have friends or just hire people in the system who simply just wanted to protect him. Jacoba described how the people in his community kept on backing him about how much of a wonderful man he was, but they weren't putting it into perspective on how they would feel if they found out that not only was their wife unknowingly impregnated by their doctor that they trusted, but they were lied to for so many years about it. But fortunately, on the contrary, not everybody who knew him were quick to excuse his actions. His former partner, Dr. Culver, even stated, quote, "There's the Don Cline we knew, that I knew well. And there's the Don Cline I would have never imagined, and it broke my heart. Evil. If Don was right here, I'd say that right to his face." In the end, Cline finally pled guilty to 2 felony counts of obstruction of justice.
Your Honor, I'm asking for mercy and compassion for myself. I've tried to live up my life showing honesty and care to others, and I will continue to do so.
This is a level 6 felony. However, Cline served absolutely no jail time for his crimes. Instead, he received a $500 fine and a suspended sentence. Many were shocked how this sentencing was so light, but it appeared to be simply because technically relating to the actual inseminations, he didn't do anything that could have been deemed as legally wrong. And not only this, but he admitted to his obstruction of justice case in court. In response, after the sentencing was announced, Prosecutor Terry Curry stated, quote, "Not only did Dr. Cline abuse his position of complete trust with his patients, his decisions will have lasting impact through generations of the impacted families. There were significant limitations to how a criminal case could proceed against Dr. Cline, but ultimately he admitted to his actions and to intentionally misleading investigators." Following his felony conviction on August 23, 2018, Cline willingly surrendered his medical license, and the Indiana Medical Board voted to never allow it to be reinstated. Not only this, but the siblings and families affected later brought civil suits against Cline and his group Indiana Infertility Incorporation. They were soon enough awarded more than $1.3 million for their emotional pain and suffering. But money wasn't going to change what happened, and they wanted to make sure that things were put in place to make sure this never happened again. After sentencing, Jacoba and the other donor siblings pushed the representatives enough for change. And soon enough, a law was passed in Indiana that made illicit donor insemination illegal. The law was put in place to protect misrepresentation of a medical procedure or of human reproductive material. And specifically, it was announced that, quote, "On May 17, 2019, Indiana became the first state to designate fertility fraud as a level 6 felony. Subsequently later, 8 other states had added similar laws. However, there was still no federal law against insemination fraud." This story did get shared around the world. It has also been featured on several news channels, television shows, and even, as mentioned, on a Netflix documentary. But there was some controversy with the Netflix documentary, as after its release on May 11th, 2022, some of the donor children had sued Netflix for sharing their personal information when they wished to remain anonymous. Jacoba herself even mentioned how there was a bit of disagreement regarding whether she should stay public about the case or not. In the beginning, the original 4 siblings were said to have even, quote, "exchanged heated text messages," as Jacoba argued the pros of publicity while the other 3 argued for the cons. They themselves preferred to remain anonymous and were worried that if the story was truly out there, that it would be sensationalized. Not only this, but they did not want to have to relive such a painful situation again, which is very fair, especially since I'm sure many would just like to put this behind them. They asked Jacoba to stop doing interviews with media outlets, and she was given the ultimatum to either continue speaking about it or they would cut contact with her, which was tough because it was said she did develop an extremely strong relationship with them. She got close to her half-siblings and even texted a lot of them very regularly. In fact, in 2015, they spent time together during Christmas. But Jacoba did in fact continue speaking and raising awareness towards insemination fraud, as well as some other siblings, including the many others who I've been mentioning. And the case against Netflix is still ongoing now. Although it is terrible to think about, Dr. Cline's case unfortunately was not unique. In fact, this was actually a fairly common-ish crime. It's said that throughout the 1970s and even early 90s, several OBGYNs had allegedly been inseminating unsuspecting patients with their own sperm. In fact, it's said that there have been more than 44 cases of physicians using their own sperm to impregnate their patients, discovered in the United States and abroad. Some notable mentions include Cecil Jacobson, John Boyd Coates III, Kim McMorris, and very recently known Jan Carbet. Some of these doctors, for example, Jan Carbet, it's suspected by some that he fathered up to 200 children. Surgeon John Hunter is widely accepted as the first to have performed an artificial insemination reported in a medical literature in 1790. And Dr. William Pancoast is widely accepted as the first doctor to conduct an artificial insemination from a donor in a medical setting in 1884. After he realized that a couple's trouble with conceiving was due to the semen lacking spermatozoa, which is the actual male sex cell that's needed to fertilize an egg, Dr. Pankos then tried raising the husband's sperm count up. But after 2 months of treatment not working, he decided that in order to impregnate the wife, he would simply just use sperm from one of the medical students to inject into the wife. Fun fact, he actually used the medical student who was deemed as the most attractive. And boom, fast forward later, the wife is pregnant, gives birth to a baby boy, and the couple was happy. Dr. Pankos kept this on the low, and he didn't mention anything to the couple until years later when he told the husband, as the gravity of the situation was probably weighing on his heart. And the husband himself was actually so happy they were able to have a kid, and he was so thankful, he decided that for his wife's sake, it was best to just not tell her at all. Now, the secrecy that Dr. Pankos used when he and the students impregnated the wife continued even as artificial insemination continued to progress. In 1987, a national survey of fertility doctors found that 2% of physicians had admitted to using their own sperm in patients. But like many doctors who have done this, regarding one of the other doctors I just mentioned, Cecil Jacobson, his defense attorney stated, quote, "If Cecil made any mistakes, it was in losing his objectivity and trying so hard to get patients pregnant." I'm positive that these doctors, including Cline, could have never imagined the rise of consumer DNA testing and tracing ancestry. These were probably advancements they didn't see happening anytime soon, and they genuinely probably never thought that their actions would be discovered. While many, including Cline, have claimed that they thought it was the right thing to do because they had just had these desperate women needing their help to get pregnant, regarding this case, there's speculation that there may have been something greater behind Cline's motives. And a lot of the speculations do sound quite reasonable, especially after some discoveries Jacoba made during the investigation. Many believe that Cline's motives had a lot to do with the ideas including power, God complexes, science experiments, and even a master race. Most often, these cases are discussed as a power play for a doctor to knowingly conceive his own children without the knowledge of the mother, because it's a way they can feel like they're in control. And this is almost adjacent to the reasoning behind doing this for his own gratification purposes. In some ways, these doctors thought they were God, or at least trying to play God. To them, they were choosing to create life, and they had this immense power to pick which pieces they would gather up to create a baby. Which brings up the other speculation with this being tied to eugenics. I did a video on this a little bit ago, but by him using his own sperm, this could have been his way of trying to create a master race through selective breeding. Cline was able to use this as an opportunity to impart specific traits that he might have thought were better for the world. He might have seen himself as being the best and solely wanted to create children of his own race, characteristics, or abilities. Some, including Jason, sibling 48, briefly mentioned maybe it was to further his career or to be the best of the best. And lastly, and simply put, this could have just been a sick science experiment. He genuinely may have just wanted to see what would happen and didn't care whether it was ethical or not. Now, to talk a little bit more on the religion aspect of everything that I mentioned earlier, because this is some serious speculation. Some have speculated that the reason Cline might have done this was due to a religious cult he was allegedly a part of. Many of Cline's donor children believed that he was actually a part of what's called the Quiverfull movement. And this is a cult or a movement that was said to encourage members to have many children. Quiverfull is defined on Wikipedia as, quote, "a Christian theological position that sees large families as a blessing from God. It encourages procreation, abstaining from all forms of birth control, natural family planning, and sterilization reversal." The movement derives its name from Psalm chapter 127, verse 3 to 5, where many children are metaphorically referred to as the arrows in a full quiver.
God says children are a blessing. We should want to have our quiver full of them.
It was said that as part of this movement, children are supposedly encouraged to seek political positions to change civilization to follow that of the Bible. Some examples you might have seen that a lot of people believe live this sort of quiverful lifestyle are the Duggars, aka the family from the TLC show 19 Kids and Counting. And Heather mentioned this on the film, and I briefly mentioned this, but it was said that at the time when Cline was impregnating these patients, a goal of Quiverfull was to produce more of the white race, because there was a fear that other races were taking over and white people would disappear. Many believe that the Quiverfull movement advocates for having more white children and that they uphold white supremacy ideologies in their attempts to preserve the white or Aryan race over other races. And like mentioned, this especially is something a lot of the donor children believe to be true, especially when they realized and acknowledged that each of them have Aryan-like similarities, whether that included being white, having blonde hair, and or having blue eyes. Now, the reason why many of the donor children suspected that Cline was affiliated with this movement in the first place was for a few reasons. One, Cline only produced Caucasian children, so this played a significant part in this speculation. Two, they found that on the Quiverfull website, they often heavily quote the scripture, Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, which stated, "Before I formed you in your mother's womb, I knew you." Which, if we remember, was the same scripture that Cline had given to Jacoba when explaining his reasoning for everything. And this was actually the same scripture which he had up in his office. And three, some have speculated that the reason the Attorney General was so reluctant to do anything about this case was because they said that he was allegedly a member of Quiverfull himself. So this might have been a sort of protection situation. Because during the investigation, Jacoba said she received an email from the Attorney General's office. And when she looked at the people who were included in this email, she noticed that one of the email addresses had a domain belonging to a member of the Quiverfull movement. While this theory, of course, isn't proven and does not seem to have direct evidence to back it up, it still is something to think about. But regardless, as a whole, with doctors who've done something like this, all seemed to not care whether it was unethical, regardless of their reasoning for doing it. Finding this information out has been very tough for these siblings. There's reports of many being led to question themselves on their identity or who they are. Jacoba is also quoted saying, quote, "All I could keep thinking about was my mom was laying there 20 years old and this man who was the age of my grandparents took advantage of her. And I don't know that time. I said, I bet there's hundreds of us. And I wanted everyone in the state of Indiana that had ever went to him to be aware and to know." One of the donor children even said, quote, "There's no idiot's guide to finding out that your biological father is your mother's fertility doctor." With another donor child saying, quote, "My reality is forever altered. I don't know what normal is anymore. Though aspects of this journey have broken me, some have made me stronger. Journeys usually come to an end, but my journey will be a roller coaster. And unfortunately, I cannot step off the ride." And Julie even stated, quote, "I may share half of his DNA, but he's not my father, and he never will be." Truly, if Cline really just admitted the true reason he thought what he did was okay, many people probably wouldn't need to speculate at all. The donor children described how if Cline just told them why he did this, they wouldn't have to use all types of conspiracy theories to try guiding them. Director Lucy Jordan of the Netflix documentary even stated, quote, "When your reality is completely shattered, you search for answers." All in all, it's just very twisted and sick to imagine regarding Cline and even the other physicians that their motives or intentions were that they were really trying to help others. Because yes, obviously these parents wanted a child, but if you were truly trying to help, there would have been no reason to hide what you were doing. And even if you thought you were trying to help the parents, you must have really not cared for the actual child, knowing they would have hundreds of siblings living in the same vicinity and that could be a major problem, especially if they themselves were to meet and maybe even try having children of their own. And especially when considering the fact that you knew you had health issues which could have got passed down to the children, and these health issues actually did get passed down to a lot of them, yet you still thought it was okay to go ahead and use your own sperm without your patient's consent. This obviously has drastic and long-lasting effects on the individuals involved. It's an extremely life-changing situation, and while some of these individuals have embraced the change and made an effort to get to know their new siblings or family, many others have shut down. Knowing your entire life had been masked by lies can be a new and unexpected burden. Looking online for even just a few minutes, many stories of self-discovery written by a lot of these donor children can be found. Many of these posts discuss the complex emotions associated with family secrets, DNA testing, and meeting new siblings. Although these stories all share similar premises, the emotional reactions and physical response are as varied as every person. For Cline to even remotely think what he did was the only option to help his patients is truly beyond comprehensible. Today in the United States, more than 1 million babies were born with sperm provided from commercial sperm banks during the last 40 years. As of 2021, the global sperm market was valued at $5.08 billion, with North America controlling 43.4% of the market revenue. With this large market that continues to grow, recently there's been large discussion as to whether sperm donors should be allowed to remain anonymous or not. This is simply because the secrecy and anonymous nature of this industry can potentially foster the crime of insemination fraud, like in this case. With staying anonymous, patients may never truly know what sperm they are being treated with, because clearly the sample could have come from anyone regardless of what they were told. There are also concerns about the conceived children, as keeping anonymous might prevent them from knowing the true and extensive medical history from their donor's family. Things like genetic predispositions of diseases and conditions that the child may suffer from as they age are often things that are not fully disclosed. One of the biggest debates in the question of anonymous donors is parental rights. Would a sperm donor deserve parental rights? Will they need to pay child support for the children who were conceived with their sperm? Can they be forced to take part in the child's life even if they don't want to? Can they force their way into a child's life if the parents want the donor to remain unknown? These debates are controversial, with many people supporting either side of the issue, but they are insightful questions to think about. It's hard to say for sure which option is more ethical and in the best interest of the families affected. But overall, what Cline did was disgusting, and I'm glad at the very least he's retired and doesn't have his medical license anymore. And I'm also glad that those affected have more answers that they went so long without knowing. Hopefully, with the laws in place, cases like this can be avoided and change can be done to avoid this on a national and even international scale soon. But yes, that is it for today's case. What are your thoughts on this story? Do you think Cline should have had a harsher sentencing? Do you think sperm donors should or shouldn't be anonymous? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any other videos on medical cases, crime, and mysteries. Bye now. I wanted to point out that that was like his friend's daughter, because like, how are you gonna do that to your own friend? What's wrong with you? Like, are you good, fam? Like, what? How are you gonna do that to your own friend? Like, that's just foul. It's foul to do this to anyone, but like, you're really gonna say it in your friend's face, oh, I'm gonna help you conceive with your wife, and use your own sperm? That's crazy.